I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A weekend in a cabin, far away from everything, nestled in the mountains, was exactly what I needed. It was supposed to be a break from the chaos of everyday life, a chance to recharge, enjoy nature, and disconnect. The cabin was completely off the grid, miles away from the nearest town, no neighbors for miles in any direction. It was just me, the trees, and the quiet hum of the wilderness. No cell service, no internet, just the sounds of nature, the rustling of the trees, and the occasional call of a distant animal. The perfect escape. The first day went exactly as I had imagined. I spent the afternoon exploring the area around the cabin, narrow dirt trails that wound through towering pines, rocks, and streams. The air was fresh, and the silence was unlike anything I had ever experienced. At night, I sat on the porch, watching the stars twinkle against the pitch-black sky, sipping tea, and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, almost eerily so, but in a way that felt calming. There was no hurry, no obligations, just me and the wilderness. The second day was much of the same, but as the sun began to set, a faint unease began to creep in. I couldn't place it at first. There was nothing unusual about the place. Everything was still, serene, untouched, but there was a subtle tension in the air. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired from the long hike earlier. After a simple dinner, I went to bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep. That's when it all started. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the shrill ring of my phone. I had been in a deep sleep, so for a moment, I didn't register the sound. But then it came again, the phone vibrating against the wooden table by my bed. I groggily reached for it, my mind still foggy with sleep. I knew there was no cell service in the area, there couldn't be. I had tried, unsuccessfully, to check my messages earlier that day. So, when I saw the screen light up with an incoming call, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of confusion and curiosity. The number was unknown, just a random string of digits. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something in me compelled me to answer. I swiped the screen and put the phone to my ear, hearing only static at first. I frowned and held the phone tighter, trying to make out the sound. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky from sleep. There was a long pause, and then, through the crackling noise, a voice, distorted, almost unrecognizable. "Get out. He's coming." The words sent a chill down my spine. The voice sounded urgent, almost panicked, and yet, there was something cold and deliberate about it. I didn't know who it was or what they meant, but I knew instantly that I was no longer alone. Before I could respond, the line went dead. The sudden silence in my ear felt suffocating, like I had just been yanked from one reality into another. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no signal, nothing. I tried calling back, but the screen only displayed a message that there was no service. I tossed the phone aside, my mind racing, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. What the hell just happened? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had somehow managed to call me despite the lack of signal. But deep down, I knew that didn't explain the urgency, the fear in the voice, the message itself. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come. The air in the cabin felt suddenly heavier, thicker, like the walls were closing in. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, and for the first time, I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I rolled over and checked the locks on the windows, the doors. I had locked everything before going to bed, but I did it again, just to be sure. The wind outside continued to rage, and the sound of the trees creaking in the distance sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled the blankets tighter around myself, my back pressed against the door, as though I could keep whatever it was out. I listened intently, but all I could hear was the storm, the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig from outside. My mind kept replaying the words, "He's coming." Who was he? And why did it sound like the person was warning me? But at the same time, the voice felt detached, almost like it was watching me from somewhere far away. The minutes stretched into hours. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, I was alone in the mountains. There was no one else around for miles. I was safe, but that didn't stop the feeling of eyes watching me. The wind outside grew louder, and a sudden gust rattled the cabin, making me jump. I sat up, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I had barely slept. I forced myself out of bed, my legs shaky, and went to the window. I needed to see the world outside, to reassure myself that everything was fine. But when I looked out, my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the mud. Fresh, muddy prints that led directly toward the back of the cabin. I scanned the area, my breath caught in my throat, but there was no sign of anyone. No figures lurking in the trees, no shadows moving in the distance. Just the footprints, single file, as though someone had walked around the cabin during the night. I grabbed my jacket and went outside to examine them more closely. The ground around the cabin was soft, and the prints were unmistakable, large, heavy steps, the kind a person would leave if they were walking through wet mud. But what disturbed me most was how they seemed to stop right at the back of the cabin, as if the person had been standing there watching the cabin before they left. I walked around to the back of the cabin, heart pounding in my chest, my eyes scanning every corner, every tree, every shadow. Nothing. It was as if whoever had left those prints had vanished into thin air. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach as I turned back to the cabin. I had to get out. The peaceful solitude I had once enjoyed now felt suffocating, like I was being hunted by something that wasn't human. I packed my things quickly, not caring about the mess, and grabbed my keys. But as I was about to leave, I stopped. I hadn't heard anything in the night. No footsteps, no sounds outside my cabin, other than the wind. So why had someone been there? Why did I get that call? And why was I still so sure that I wasn't alone? I couldn't stay there any longer. I wasn't sure what had happened, or who, or what had been watching me, but I needed to leave before whatever it was returned. I drove down the winding mountain road, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away from the cabin, away from the woods. It was only when I got back to civilization, to a place with cell service, that I finally had the chance to look at my phone again. The screen showed a single, missed call from the same number. I stared at it for a long time before I tapped the screen and deleted the message, hoping that the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest would go with it. I never went back to that cabin. I never found out who called me, or who had been watching me that night, but I still think about it sometimes. The feeling of being watched, the unease that never left me, the prints around the cabin that no one could explain. It's been years now, and I still can't shake the feeling that something was out there, something I wasn't meant to see. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky was streaked with reds and oranges, and the air had a cool bite to it, signaling the approach of night. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by dense woods, just far enough from the nearest town to feel isolated. It was an old place, weathered by time with sagging beams and peeling paint. The driveway was a narrow, gravel path that crunched beneath the weight of my car as I pulled up to the door. The cabin looked like something out of an old storybook, the kind that would be nestled on the edge of a mountain or tucked into the woods, forgotten by time. It wasn't big, just a small, one-room building with a tin roof and a porch that creaked when I stepped on it. The windows were a little too dirty to see through clearly, but the flicker of the last sunlight caught the dusty glass, making the cabin look even more abandoned than it really was. I didn't mind, though. It felt peaceful, like a quiet retreat from the world, and that's exactly what I needed. I unloaded my things and brought them inside. The smell of old wood and stale air greeted me, a musty scent that seemed to seep out from the walls. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots as I moved around, the sound echoing in the silence. There was a fireplace at the far end of the room, the kind with a stone hearth and an iron grate. I quickly got a fire going, the crackling flames filling the cabin with warmth and light. The place was sparse but cozy, an old leather couch, a few wooden chairs, a rickety table with mismatched chairs, and a small radio in the corner. The radio looked like it had been around for decades. Its metal body rusted in places, the dial worn smooth from years of use. I decided to spend the night here alone with no distractions. I'd been craving solitude for a while. I unpacked my bag, set up my bedroll by the fireplace, and cracked open a book, letting the fire's warmth relax my muscles. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the occasional animal noise broke the otherwise still night. By the time I finished my book and the fire had burned down to embers, it was late, and I decided to turn in. I blew out the lanterns and slipped under the blankets. The bed was simple, just a mattress on the floor, but it was comfortable enough. The night passed quietly. The wind howled a bit, but the cabin stood firm, creaking and groaning, like it was alive. I wasn't used to such silence, but it wasn't unpleasant. I fell asleep fairly quickly. The next day came and went without much incident. I spent the day outside, taking in the surrounding woods and the stillness that seemed to permeate everything. There was no one for miles. It was perfect. I returned to the cabin as the sun set, ready for another night. The fire crackled again as I ate some soup I'd made on the stovetop, the warm light from the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The wind had died down, and the night felt almost eerily quiet. After a while, I decided to get ready for bed again. I went through my usual routine, brushing my teeth, making sure everything was secure, and turning off the lights. The air inside the cabin had a chill to it, so I piled a few more logs on the fire and went to bed, pulling the covers up tight around me. The flames flickered in the fireplace, casting a dim glow that made the cabin seem cozy, if not a little unnerving in its solitude. That's when I heard it. A faint static noise, almost imperceptible at first, coming from the radio in the corner of the room. It was so quiet that I initially thought it was just the wind or some other ambient noise, but then it grew louder. It wasn't the usual hum you'd expect from an old radio. It was more like a crackling, hissing sound. I turned my head to look at it, but it was dark in that corner, the shadows hiding most of the radio from my view. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just some interference or maybe the fire causing the old wiring in the radio to act up. But then the sound changed. It wasn't just static anymore. I swear, it sounded like someone was trying to speak through the static, their voice faint but distinguishable. I lay there, frozen, staring into the dark corner of the room, my heart beating faster with each passing second. It was soft at first, like whispers. Then I heard it clearly. My name. Come outside. My name, the voice whispered. I felt a jolt of panic shoot through me. I wasn't sure why, but something about that voice felt wrong. It wasn't a friendly whisper or a calm request. It was more like a demand, a pull that I couldn't ignore. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my skin prickling with unease. I didn't move. I kept my eyes locked on the radio, hoping the sound would stop, but it didn't. Instead, it grew louder. Come outside, the voice repeated, clearer this time, as if it were standing just outside the door. My pulse raced. My body wanted to move, to get up and do something, anything, but I couldn't. It felt like I was paralyzed, caught between fear and the strange, undeniable urge to obey. I could hear the static swirling around the words, like someone was right there, on the other side of the radio trying to reach me. I didn't know what to do. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination or that I was just being paranoid. But the voice, calm and insistent, continued. Come outside. My name. And then I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some animal moving around outside. But then the steps grew louder, deliberate, like someone walking through the leaves and crunching the branches. There was a pause, and then they continued, getting closer. My heart raced, and I held my breath, too terrified to make a sound. I couldn't explain it, but I knew someone, or something, was out there. The footsteps were steady, rhythmic, and they were coming toward the cabin. My mind raced. What was going on? Was someone out there? Should I get up and check? Should I hide? I couldn't make sense of it. My instincts told me to stay still, to not make a sound, but the feeling of dread washed over me, making me want to run, to get out of the cabin and away from whatever was outside. But I didn't move, couldn't. My body was frozen with fear, and all I could do was lie there, listening to the footsteps slowly approach the cabin. They stopped just outside the door. There was a long pause and agonizing silence. My eyes were wide open now, and my hands were clenched into fists. I could feel the sweat on my palms, could feel the pounding of my heart in my ears. The voice on the radio was silent now, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were waiting. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes, maybe hours, it felt like an eternity. The silence was unbearable. My mind spun and I tried to think of what to do. I had to leave. I couldn't stay there, not with someone or something lurking outside. But I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I slowly pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to control my breathing. My eyes darted toward the door, then back to the window, but it was too dark to see anything. There was no movement, no sound, nothing except the stillness of the cabin and the night outside. And then, finally, I heard it. A faint, creaking sound, like a door slowly opening. I didn't dare look, but I knew. The footsteps had moved again, this time toward the door. I couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, I jumped out of bed, grabbed my coat and boots, and bolted for the door. I didn't care if I made noise. I just had to get out. The door was unlocked, and I wrenched it open, the cold night air hitting my face as I stumbled out onto the porch. I didn't stop to look back, didn't care about anything but getting as far away as possible. I ran into the woods, not caring where I was going. My breath came in short gasps, my legs aching as I pushed myself forward. The ground was uneven, covered in twigs and fallen leaves, and I stumbled more than once, but I didn't stop. My heart pounded in my chest, and the fear that had gripped me inside the cabin now had a physical presence, urging me on. I kept running, hearing nothing but my own breath and the pounding of my feet against the forest floor. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found the old gravel road again. My legs were shaking, my breath ragged, but I didn't care. I turned and looked back toward the cabin, the dark shape of it barely visible in the distance, and that's when I realized it was quiet. Too quiet. The footsteps, the voice, everything had stopped. I stood there for a moment, staring back at the cabin, my mind racing. Had I imagined it all? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't know, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going back. I called a cab from a nearby town and waited in the dark for what felt like hours. When it finally arrived, I got in without a word, not daring to look back at the cabin. The driver didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any answers. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. I never returned. The cabin I rented seemed perfect for a weekend getaway. Remote, nestled in the woods, away from the hustle and bustle. When I arrived, it looked just like the pictures. A small, wooden structure, surrounded by towering pine trees. The air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. It was exactly what I needed. I had been working nonstop for months, and I needed a break from the constant noise of the city. A weekend alone in a cozy cabin was just what I thought would help clear my head. I opened the door and stepped inside. The interior was just as charming as the outside. Wooden beams lined the ceiling, and the walls were adorned with rustic decor, old-fashioned lamps, woven rugs, and vintage furniture. It had a cozy, lived-in feel, like it had been standing there for years, hosting quiet nights and warm conversations. The large stone fireplace looked inviting, and the big windows let in plenty of light, giving the cabin a warm and comfortable atmosphere. I quickly unpacked and settled in, eager to enjoy my time alone. I made a fire, sat back in the armchair, and just listened to the crackling of the wood burning. I was finally able to breathe, away from the stress of my regular life. The place felt safe, peaceful. But then there was that door, the basement door. It was located at the end of the small hallway near the kitchen, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. At first, I thought nothing of it, but as the evening wore on, I kept noticing it. The basement door was always slightly ajar, just enough to hint at something behind it. Not wide open, not completely closed. It was as if someone had left it half open, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't supposed to be that way. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just an old cabin, and things didn't always fit properly. Maybe the door was just worn down from years of use. But every night before I went to bed, I would get up and close it. I'd hear the slight creak of the door as I pushed it shut, and it would stay that way until morning. But without fail, the door would always be open again by the time I woke up. Just a crack, but it was enough to unsettle me. The first night, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. The wind, maybe, or some sort of trick with the house settling. But the next night, when the same thing happened again, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided I had to know what was behind that door. I wasn't someone who was easily spooked, but the door, just the sight of it, felt wrong. It wasn't just that it was left open. It was the feeling it gave off, like it was waiting for something to happen. Maybe it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was messing with me. So, the second night, after dinner and just as the last bit of light was fading from the sky, I stood up and walked toward the door. The air in the cabin had grown cooler, and I could see my breath just a little bit as I reached for the handle. My hand lingered for a moment before I opened it, half expecting something to jump out at me. Didn't. The basement was quiet. I flicked on the light switch, and the bulb overhead buzzed faintly as it warmed up. The basement stairs descended into a dark space, and I felt a slight chill crawl up my spine. It was colder down there, despite the warmth upstairs. The smell hit me next, faint but unmistakable. Something rotten. My stomach turned at the scent, and I hesitated for a moment, wondering if maybe I should just leave it alone. But I didn't. I had to know. I took a step down the first stair, then another, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. With each step, the cold grew more intense, and the smell grew stronger. It was like old food, something left to rot in the dark, and it was coming from somewhere deep in the basement. The beam of light from the stairs barely cut through the darkness, leaving most of the room in shadow. The basement seemed bigger than I had expected, full of old furniture covered in dusty white sheets. There were old chairs, a table, some boxes stacked against the walls, things that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I walked further down, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old wood underfoot. The basement felt even colder now, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake off the discomfort that was growing in me. It was supposed to be a peaceful, relaxing trip, but now I was standing in a dark, musty basement, feeling more and more uneasy by the second. But then, as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. It was just a flicker at first, but I saw it clearly when I stepped closer. Fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. I froze. They were right there in the middle of the room, leading up to the base of the stairs. The prints were clear and fresh, the dust around them disturbed. They were made by bare feet, and they looked recent, very recent. I hadn't been down here before. I had been the only one in the cabin, and I was certain no one else had been inside. My heart started pounding in my chest. I took a shaky breath, stepping closer to the stairs. The prints were heading straight for them, as if someone had been standing right there, watching me come down. I stood there, frozen, staring at the footprints in the dust. How was it possible? Who had been down here? My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I was alone. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere. There was no way anyone could have come in without me hearing them. I backed away slowly, my eyes still glued to the footprints. I didn't want to turn my back on them, but I couldn't stay in that basement any longer. I turned and climbed up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest, and closed the door behind me. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the door, trying to calm my breathing. What had I seen down there? What had made those footprints? The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep much, too anxious to relax. I kept checking the door, but I couldn't bring myself to open it again. I kept thinking about those footprints, the fresh ones that weren't mine, but I couldn't figure it out. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, or maybe someone had broken in, though I couldn't imagine how they could have gotten in without me hearing. I didn't know what to think. The next morning, I woke up early. I didn't want to face the day, but I knew I had to. I packed up my things quickly, trying not to look at the basement door. I didn't even want to think about what I had seen the night before. I just wanted to leave. The cabin that had seemed so charming when I arrived now felt cold and oppressive. The air felt heavy, and every creak of the wood made my heart jump. I didn't stay another night. Couldn't. I left that morning, driving away from the cabin and into the safety of the open road. The further I got, the more I felt the tension leave my body. But I couldn't shake the image of those footprints in the dust. The thought that someone had been in that basement, in that cabin with me, sent chills down my spine. I never returned to that cabin. Couldn't. I don't know who or what had been there, but I do know one thing. It was something I didn't want to face again. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. My girlfriend and I had been planning this trip for months. An escape from the noisy, crowded city life. The kind of weekend where you can just disconnect, enjoy some peace and quiet, and recharge your batteries. So we booked a cabin in the middle of nowhere, nestled deep in the woods. The place was far enough from civilization that we wouldn't have to worry about anything except the rustling of the trees and the occasional chirp of birds. No cell service, no internet, just us and nature. When we arrived, the cabin was exactly what we'd hoped for. A little rustic but cozy. The air was crisp, and there was that unmistakable smell of pine and earth in the air. The first night was perfect. We lit a fire in the wood stove, opened a bottle of wine, and just sat there, talking, laughing, and enjoying the simple pleasure of being far away from the grind of daily life. The kind of peace you only get when you're truly alone. We went to bed early, excited for the next day's hike. The plan was simple. Get up, have a leisurely breakfast, and then spend the day exploring the trails that wound through the surrounding forest. It was going to be exactly the kind of weekend we needed. But when we woke up the next morning, something felt off. I first noticed it when I was brushing my teeth. I walked over to the back door to open the window for some fresh air, and that's when I saw it. The door was slightly ajar. First, I thought it might be nothing. Maybe I had forgotten to lock it the night before, or maybe the wind had pushed it open. But no, I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. I checked the lock again. Nothing seemed broken. It was just open. Did you leave the door open? I asked my girlfriend. She shook her head, looking confused. No, I'm pretty sure we both locked it. We shrugged it off. It was probably just the wind. There wasn't much else to think about. So we went ahead with our plans, packed our bags, and went out for our hike. The forest was beautiful, dense, quiet, and peaceful. We spent the whole day out there, lost in the sounds of nature, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath our boots, the cool air on our faces. Felt good to be outside, away from the stress of everyday life. When we got back to the cabin that evening, I noticed the door was open again. This time, it was wider than before, like someone had intentionally left it that way. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe we had just been forgetful. Maybe the wind had done it again. But something gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I checked the door to make sure it was still intact. No signs of forced entry, no broken lock. Everything seemed normal, but something wasn't right. We spent the evening inside, eating dinner and watching the fire crackle. I kept glancing at the door, wondering if I should check it again, but I tried to put it out of my mind. It was probably nothing. Maybe we were just being paranoid. As the night settled in, I started to feel more and more on edge. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. There was something about this place, something unsettling. It was as if the quiet wasn't just peaceful. It was oppressive. Every little sound, every creak of the cabin, felt too loud, too deliberate. We went to bed around midnight. The wind had picked up outside, and I could hear it howling through the trees. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something, a soft tapping against the window, I told myself it was just branches from the trees, swaying in the wind, but the tapping was too regular, too rhythmic, like someone was gently knocking at the window. My girlfriend was already asleep beside me, and I didn't want to wake her up. I tried to roll over and ignore the noise, but it kept going. The tapping, slow and steady, like it was trying to get my attention. I finally had enough. I got up, my heart pounding, and walked over to the window. I pulled back the curtain, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty yard. No one was outside, no movement, nothing. I stood there for a moment, staring into the night, but the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from the other window now, on the other side of the cabin. I moved quietly through the house, checking each window, each door. Nothing. No one was outside. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My nerves were shot, and I was starting to feel paranoid. When I went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, I froze. The fridge door was wide open. I hadn't opened it when we left for our hike earlier, and there was no reason for it to be open now. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of it. The fridge was emptying out. Some of the items inside were missing: half a loaf of bread, some fruit, a few cans of soup. I hadn't eaten any of it. We hadn't touched it. It was like someone had come in and taken it. I quickly bolted the fridge shut, my mind racing. I checked the locks on the windows and doors again, but everything seemed secure. Still, something wasn't right. I went back to the bedroom, my nerves on edge. I crawled into bed, my heart still pounding. I wanted to say something to my girlfriend, but I didn't want to wake her. I tried to lay still, tried to close my eyes, but the tapping was still there. It was coming from outside again, but this time it sounded different. Faster, more urgent. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and moved to the door, checking the locks one last time before going back to bed. But when I crawled under the covers again, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching us. The tapping continued, echoing through the cabin like a steady drumbeat. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. The fear was building in my chest, spreading like a cold wave. I couldn't explain it, but I knew someone had been inside our cabin. I finally fell into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake a few hours later by a loud noise from outside. It sounded like something heavy was dragging across the ground. My heart was racing as I sat up in bed, listening. The noise stopped. I didn't want to move, but I had to. I slowly got out of bed, moving silently through the cabin. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my flashlight, and I checked every room. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, just the sound of branches or animals. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That's when I found the note. It was sitting on the doorstep, placed carefully, like someone had left it there for me to find. "You should have left when you had the chance." The words were scrawled in messy, hurried handwriting, and my blood ran cold. The note was a warning, but it didn't make sense. Who would leave something like that? And why? I stared at the note for a long time, my mind racing. I didn't know who could have left it or how they knew we were there. We hadn't told anyone about our plans, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here. But somehow, someone had been watching us. Someone had been inside our cabin. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the trees or from the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the same stillness of the woods, the same eerie quiet. I picked up the note and backed away from the door, locking it behind me. My girlfriend was still asleep, unaware of what had happened. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to scare her. The truth was, I didn't know what was real anymore. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe the note was a sick joke. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out who had been watching us, or why. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. We packed up early the next day, too scared to stay any longer. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin in the rearview mirror, feeling a weight in my chest. I wanted to forget everything that had happened, but the fear lingered, the uncertainty hanging in the air like the smell of damp earth. And to this day, I still wonder who left that note, and what they wanted from us. had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A break from the usual chaos. A chance to finally get some writing done in a quiet, secluded cabin. The place I had rented was small, rustic, and tucked away in the woods. A perfect spot to unwind. It was exactly what I needed. The drive out there had been peaceful, the landscape slowly shifting from urban sprawl to dense forest as I neared the cabin. There was something comforting about being so far removed from everything. No distractions, no noise, just the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves. When I arrived, I was greeted by the faint smell of pine and the cool, crisp air. The cabin itself was simple but charming. It had a small wooden porch with 2 rocking chairs and a view of a nearby creek that ran through the trees. Inside, the cabin was just as cozy. A small living area with a fireplace, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a loft above that held the bed. There was a writing desk by the window, just perfect for the work I had planned. The owner had left a note saying to make myself at home, and that if I needed anything, there was a phone number for emergencies. The first night was uneventful. I spent the evening by the fire, sipping tea and reading, before eventually heading to bed. The silence was soothing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. I had no reason to believe the weekend would be anything less than perfect. I went to sleep that night with the window cracked just enough to hear the gentle flow of the creek. The next morning, I woke up feeling rested, ready to dive into my writing. I had set my cabin keys on the kitchen table the night before, along with my car keys and a few other things I had unpacked. I had no intention of leaving that day, but I liked to keep my keys in a central location in case I needed them. But when I walked into the kitchen the next morning, something immediately felt off. The keys were gone. I stood there for a moment, blinking in confusion. Maybe I had just forgotten where I put them. I checked under the table, around the stove, and even the bathroom. No keys. They were just gone. I walked outside to the porch and checked around, hoping I had dropped them somewhere, but there was nothing. The strange thing was, I was certain I had left them on the table. There was no reason for them to be gone. I shrugged it off as a moment of forgetfulness. Maybe I'd moved them without thinking, or maybe I tossed them in my bag. I didn't want to waste time worrying about it. I decided to head out for a walk around the property, hoping to clear my head. The woods were quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where you could hear every little sound. A bird's call, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the wind whispering through the trees. I enjoyed the solitude and the simplicity of it all. But when I returned, something was different. There, on the porch, right next to the door, were my keys. Both sets. My cabin keys and car keys, laid on the ground as if someone had placed them there deliberately. I froze, staring at them. It wasn't possible. How could they have gotten there? I had checked everywhere earlier. There was no way I had missed them. I picked them up slowly, scanning the area around the porch, but there was no sign of anyone. I even checked the surrounding woods, convinced someone might be watching me. The feeling of unease began to creep into my bones, but I tried to brush it off. It was just a strange coincidence. I told myself, maybe I had just overlooked them somehow, or maybe the owner had been by to check something. It was the kind of place where people sometimes stopped by to check on things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the day turned into night, I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled down to work, but I couldn't concentrate. Every time the wind picked up or a twig cracked outside, I found myself glancing nervously toward the windows. My mind kept drifting back to the keys. Who would have moved them, and why? That night, I slept fitfully. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified, and the crackling of the fire did little to soothe me. I woke up several times, each time feeling like I wasn't alone, though I knew logically that I was. But it wasn't until the third day that things really started to get strange. It began when I woke up in the morning and, once again, the keys were gone. I checked everywhere, under the couch cushions, behind the table, even outside, nothing. This time, though, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. The absence of the keys felt deliberate, almost sinister. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it was harder to ignore now. I spent most of the day pacing, trying to write, trying to calm myself. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I couldn't stop thinking about the keys. Who would take them, and why? I even considered the possibility that I was losing my mind. Around dusk, I decided to go out and get some firewood, hoping the physical activity would help me focus. The woods were still as quiet as ever, the only sound being my boots crunching on the dry leaves. When I came back to the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the porch again, were the keys. But this time, there was something else. My car keys were there too. I stared at them, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't make any sense. How could they have gotten here? Who was messing with me? I reached down to pick them up, my hands trembling. That's when I noticed something else, something far more disturbing. There, in the dirt just beyond the porch, was a large, unmistakable footprint. It wasn't human. The shape of it was wrong. Too large, too broad. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Who or what had been on my property? I looked around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. No movement in the trees, no sign of anyone hiding nearby. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I had spent enough time in the woods to know when something wasn't right. And now, every instinct in me was screaming that I wasn't alone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire. I kept the porch light on, but the thought of stepping outside again terrified me. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I had a growing sense that it wasn't just a coincidence anymore. By the time the third night came, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I barely slept, tossing and turning, my mind racing with thoughts of the keys, the footprints, the shadow I had seen darting between the trees the night before. I tried to convince myself I was just imagining things, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. Something was out there, something that had been watching me. When I woke up the next morning, I packed quickly, barely even bothering to make breakfast. I didn't want to stay another minute. I felt like I was being driven out, pushed to leave. I glanced out the window one last time, and that's when I saw it, written in the dirt on the back of my car. The word "leave" was scrawled there, the letters jagged and uneven. My stomach dropped. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my things and threw them into my car, not caring about being neat or organized. I just needed to get out of there. As I started the car and pulled away from the cabin, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. The woods stood silent, the same as they had been when I first arrived. The drive back felt like a blur, my mind racing with the events of the past few days. I didn't know who had been messing with me or why, but I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back to that cabin. I had no answers, only a creeping fear that whatever had been watching me was still out there, somewhere in the woods, and I had no intention of finding out what it wanted.